Hello, my name is Rowan, and today we're going to be talking special education at the intersection of race and technology. So I'm going to be evaluating two articles and essentially using those to identify how the implementation of technology has its consequences. So quickly to reiterate, I don't know if I personally want to be a teacher, but regardless, this project stood out to me because there's still not enough attention on the individual needs of those classified as special education. And either way, student needs differential. Student needs are under-addressed. I'm a sociology minor, so I think about this in the terms of being under-addressed even without the added structural baloney that comes with our democratic society. So our first article is by Dr. Wanda Blanchett, and it is Telling It Like It Is, the Role of Race, Class, and Culture in the Perpetuation of Learning Disability as a Privileged Category for the White Middle Class. That was a lot, but essentially it answers in what ways do students who receive the same label, that is learning disability, have very different in-school and then post-school experiences based upon the intersection of race and class with learning disability. So essentially, Dr. Blanchett goes off of some work by another scholar, and that scholar, who we'll get to later in these slides, essentially said that in a time of segregation, rather post-segregation, supposedly, special education identification practices became a way to ensure that white and black children were not in the same classrooms. So her name is Christine. Christine essentially said that it was used to protect and separate the white middle class children who were also failing, but the institutions or the teachers didn't want to put them on the same level as their black peers, so they came up with a different word, which is learning disability. I'll also quickly mention that the Larry P. v. Riles case ended the use of intelligent tests as the sole basis for determining special education, which is important in the points that I'm going to make here shortly. All right, so as I said, we're evaluating how those with learning disabilities have different in and post-school experiences based on race and class in association with learning disabilities. So Christine Slater wrote and argued that learning disabilities were actually used as a way to soften the same label, which I mentioned before, this label being mentally retarded, and that they were handing it out to mainly African American children, which further added a layer of segregation as they kept disproportionately labeling African American children as mentally retarded as compared to their white peers, which earned the label learning disability. Essentially, there is no explanation aside from this post-segregation racism that learning disability students received accommodations within the general classroom, and students of color with the same labels were in self-contained settings, meaning those African American students that maybe did get the label learning disability, even though they were disproportionately labeled as autistic or mentally retarded, those individuals that were on the same level of their white peers still were in self-contained settings. And essentially, Christine Slater is saying that there's no possible explanation for this aside from racism of the time. Additionally, I'd like to note that learning disability in and of itself is also privileged over developmental disabilities, in which they still overwhelmingly rely on a medical model to diagnose, such as what we've talked about before, mental retardation and autism. Essentially, both scholars make the case that learning disabilities are normalized because we associate learning disabilities with not looking too different from the average person, basically meaning that because we are choosing white individuals, which is the more dominant, powerful perpetual race, because we are choosing those individuals to label as learning disabled, we're setting up a standard that people with learning disabilities are somehow different from other disabilities because they look more normal, if you will. It's also important to mention that this varies state by state. So states determine how a learning disability is classified. So I'll hit you with a little stats here as well. African American students, 39%, were least likely to be equitably accommodated within the classroom setting again, as diagnosed with a learning disability compared to their peers. So almost 40%. And then what are the effects of this disproportional labeling of learning disability? So some effects include risk ratio, identification, dropout rates, graduation rates, and this obviously skews data on all individuals with disabilities in general, which is important to note. And essentially, what both of these authors are getting at is it's more than being educated in the same environment. Very much the important talk on equity versus equality. So it's more important than being educated in the same environment, which is what we had in this post-segregation, supposedly anti-racist environment that we were trying to create in this time, but rather, is there equitable accommodations and protocols in place for all students, that being the baseline. And in other words, if there are not, and we're continuing to perpetuate these long-standing disproportional labels, then these are essentially forms of structural racism and discrimination. So, moving into our next article, which very much relates, that was talking about special education as a label, and now we're going to talk about special education in terms of having no real guide, no real theoretical guide for teachers to base their literacy off of. So I kind of jumped ahead there, but our next article is Grounded in What Works, Exemplary Practice in Special Education Teachers Technology Integration. So right off the bat, I love that these authors here use technology in terms as it being a form of literacy, in which special education teachers simply do not have a guide. So essentially, like the other models that other teachers can use that explain best practices for tech integration, the special education teachers simply don't have or are limited to, which disproportionately affects them and their students. So let's talk about how the intention of this empirical article is looking to further the TAM and TPACK model. So the TPACK model assumes that all three domains are prerequisites, while this study, as we'll see later on, essentially says that one can override the other. So it's important to note that proficiency in technology integration is something that can be acquired, therefore literacy has to start somewhere, and that is what we're hoping to get at with this article. So, in terms of the article, the purpose is to extend the theoretical foundations of the TAM and TPACK models to generate a model that explains integration specifically into special education classroom settings. So, what are the results then? So, naturally, technology implementation is a complex and therefore can be assumed as ever interrelated. So unlike TPACK, the process here was evaluated as student-oriented. Technology was seen as a tool where there was a lack of fear. Primarily, the study's participants focused on the students' perceptions of usefulness. So that is the main difference here. This article is looking at a student-oriented view and if it is helping the student, not whether the teachers are doing the right things to make it function for the student, essentially. So yeah, some of the things that the study kind of emphasized that the teachers found was most useful is that Technology needed to be looked at as a tool, but also not a solution to everyone. So it was highly individualized. And therefore, teachers had to understand that there are limitations to technology in relation to students' skills and natural abilities. And with that, that meant that technology implementation had to emphasize the multimodal approach to use technology as a resource to accommodate for some of those students' maybe different skills and or abilities. Additionally, teachers found that it was most useful if technology was familiar and simple, therefore also accommodating to individual students. And that is so we don't make it any more harder for the students than it needs to be. That's not the goal of the technology implementation. With that, natural and necessary scaffolding included really encouraging student exploration and student independence, and ultimately the goal being self-sufficiency. They want their students to be independent in the work that they're doing and feel comfortable using the technology, which once again is that student-centered approach and also very individual to the individual student. With that, the teachers were able to set up clear expectations, clear routines, which is especially helpful for those individuals in IEPs if they're integrated into the normal classroom setting. Routines feels natural, just natural to human nature. There was also important emphasis that everybody, student and teacher alike, need to understand that with taking risks, like implementing technology into the classroom in the hopes that it'll make certain things better, it also comes with failing. It's a natural process that simply needs to be done to support technology integration. Sometimes it doesn't always work out. So ultimately, teachers evaluated this study on a teacher-to-teacher basis, so it was very objective. One that I really thought was important and emphasized the whole goal of the research study was one teacher essentially said, ultimately, does the technology integration that they're doing in the classroom move the student closer to his or her IEP goals? Once again, emphasizing that this is very individual to the student and it's a student-oriented approach. So to kind of recap there, why does this further TIM and TPACK? I know it's been a little while since I said that at the beginning. So essentially, this study found that foundational beliefs and dispositions of teachers, focusing really on what's best for the individual student, can overcome challenges as stated by TPACK's 3 prerequisites. So if we go back and look at that model, TPACK has 3 pillars on which teachers need to be completely successful and adhere to in advance. And this is essentially saying that teachers have foundational beliefs and they believe that focusing on the individual student will get them there, and listening to the student's feedback, how they're feeling, and how the technology works for them. And we just want to reevaluate why this is important. While there's no current theoretical model for special education teachers to look to grow their literacy in this area, and literacy proficiency is something that can be acquired, but you need a basis to do that. And it is in here that we are able to do that for special education students. My personal application of these 2 articles is that the special education label or learning disability label is not representative or definitive of an individual student. So going back to the first article, even though learning disability might have specific history with a specific race or class, that is highly important to note, but it's also highly important to note that that therefore does not define the individual. It's really always on their own terms and it's specific to each student. Therefore, some of my goals would be, are we meeting the students' needs on a personal level? Are we kind of ridding ourselves of the standardized mentality or standardization practices or standardization in testing or how I'm teaching or how I'm grouping based on what I'm perceiving their abilities to be? Instead, I want to view myself as simply being a mediator and equipping my students to be successful, and hopefully integrating technology that will further be a tool to help them be successful. I really want to focus on a student-centered approach with no right or wrong, which I think both articles really emphasize. Additionally, I think the TAM and TPEC models are great. But we also can't be caught generalizing, as the second article kind of explained. Education is a big part of the general education setting, and if we get caught generalizing to a specific group, then we're no better than that post-segregation that we were talking about in the first article. Therefore, I truly believe and agree with the second article that individualization is important, and it's important to remember that biological capacities are real when we're talking about technology integration. Legality is real. There are things that I can do as a teacher, and there are things that are outside my control, which might need the help of a parent or hopefully technology. Also, IEPs are made for a reason. There are individual goals for individual students, and it's my job as a teacher to adhere to those individual goals. And I need to implement technology in a way that is meeting those goals for the student. I don't want to be comparing student to student, and I definitely don't want to be comparing a student to a standardized practice. I want to really focus on those group-generated goals that are specific to each student. So, that was kind of a long video. Really delved into the two articles here. Two great articles, which are linked in the sources page right here if you want to read the whole thing. The second one is an empirical article if you're looking for something to go in your research, but I hope you enjoyed this video, and I enjoy talking about how these possible limitations and subsequent knowledge that we've gained from these readings can help me in my future endeavors as a possible teacher. So, thank you.